From the Marvel Omnibus Collection, Marvel Horror Lives Again. So as you can see, this is a library book, although this particular book was in my school library because I requested it. A year ago, I was ordering a number of different graphic novels or comic books for my school library with the intention of trying to get my students to do more extensive reading. And there's a lot of research that reading comic books can be very good for language learning and literacy development. I'm not going to get into all of that here because I've got a lot of other things to talk about in this video. But the point being, I ordered a number of comic books last year. And when I was ordering comic books, I tried to order them from across a variety of genres. So, some humorous books, some superhero books, some romance books, and I wanted to get at least one horror comic in that collection. Because, in addition to just covering the bases with my genres, I have observed in my 20 or so years of teaching English to teenagers that teenagers are just fascinated by horror. And I can relate. When I was young, I was fascinated by the horror genre as well. Now, exactly what it is about horror that so fascinates us and why it especially fascinates young people is a subject I'm largely going to sidestep. I'm sure there's an interesting philosophical discussion there, but I've actually rambled on about all my disorganized thoughts on this in previous videos in which I covered movies from the horror genre. And I think my thoughts on this are largely sophomoric, so I'll link to the videos in which I've discussed this question before, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of it here. Just suffice it to say, for whatever reason, young people are fascinated by horror, so I wanted to order this book. Now, this is Marvel Horror Lives Again, which it looks like it was published in 2020. It's the second omnibus in this collection. There was a Marvel Horror Omnibus, which I think was published in 2019. But when I was on Amazon looking for these books in preparation for requesting them from the school library, it looked like the Marvel Horror Omnibus was all sold out, as far as I can tell from Amazon anyways. The only copies available were used copies that were being sold at an inflated price, and I'm not even sure my library dealt with acquiring used books. So this one was still being sold, so this was the one I requested. Now, because I was ordering a large collection of graphic novels all together, and because I was ordering them off of the internet, I did not realize how large this sucker was. Although I arguably I should have. The information is all right there on Amazon, but I guess I didn't check. But look at this. Look at how huge this thing is. This is how many pages is this? Yeah. 1,175. Now, if you buy this for retail price, it's $125 US, but you are getting your money's worth for that money. Well, or maybe you're not actually, considering how much of this book is in black and white. Should it be a little bit cheaper? But, all I can say for me personally is this provided hours and hours of reading. I've been slowly working on this book for, I think, a couple months now. And, I'm busy. I've got jobs and kids and stuff like that. So don't have as much time to just sit around and read comic books all day as I did when I was younger. But still, even just working on this a little bit in the evenings every night, it still provided several weeks of entertainment. So, judged on a per hour basis, I guess that price is not that bad. But what is considerable is just the sheer weight of the book. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to come through on camera, but I'm actually straining a little bit to pick this up with one hand. And in terms of getting students to check this book out and take it home with them, I don't know if this was the ideal purchase in that regard, because a student is going to think twice before putting this book in their backpack for the evening. I thought twice before checking it out from the library, and it looks like in the past year it's only been checked out a couple of times, and I suspect that's because it's just so big and heavy. Now, of course, once I got it home, and it's been on my shelves here in my apartment for the past couple months, then it's a little bit more manageable, but it's still something. I mean, it's not something I can casually read over breakfast or, take out where I'm keeping half an eye on the kids. If I'm going to take this book down from the shelves, it's going to be, it's a bit heavy to lift. It's because I'm dedicating some reading time to it in the evening. Okay, well, enough about the size and weight of the book. Let's talk about what's actually in here. This is part of a collection of Marvel horror comics, as the name implies, covering Blade, Wendigo, Satana, Houdia Twist, Lilith, John Kowalski, Ulysses Bloodstone, and Amphibian. Lots of things to talk about, but hopefully I'll have time to get into all of them, at least briefly, in the course of this review. Almost all of these, or I think all of these, are from the 1970s. Maybe one or two of these are from the early 80s. One or two of these are from the early 80s, but most of these are from the 70s. And this goes with Marvel Comics Horror Collection, which had its heyday in the 1970s. Last year, both Michael K. Vaughan and Steve Donahue did videos on the Marvel horror comics from the 1970s. Now, they didn't believe they talked about any of these characters, but they talked about the phenomenon in general. I'll link to both of those videos in the description down below, because they're both worth watching. It's a nice point-counterpoint going on. Michael K. Vaughan really loved them. Steve Donahue absolutely hated them, with the exception of Tomb of Dracula, which Steve Donahue said, okay, Tomb of Dracula was good, but the rest of them were absolute crap. But yeah, and those gentlemen provide some brief background in their videos, but just to kind of briefly recap, if you're familiar with the history of comic books, you know that superheroes were a fad that occurred in the late 30s, early 40s. But then that fad went away. And for the 1950s, comic books were largely other genres. I mean, the big superheroes like Superman were still in print. But most of the rest of them were not. And instead you had Westerns, romance, funny animal stories, and horror. And again, if you're familiar with pop culture history, you know that the horror comics of the 1950s caused a bit of a moral panic. The Senate held hearings on them. The psychiatrist blamed them for juvenile delinquency. And as a result, there was a big crackdown on horror comics, and the comic book code was created, which said that you couldn't have vampires in comics. You couldn't have... There's a whole bunch of things that were against code. Now, as Michael K. Vaughan said in his video, that code was beginning to loosen up by the 70s. Society was becoming more permissive again, and so it was once again possible to publish horror comics. And as Michael K. Vaughan also said in his video, there was some smaller companies which were publishing black and white horror comics and making a lot of money publishing those cheap horror comics, and Marvel wanted in on the action. I'm not sure why DC didn't go in as big. Or maybe they did. Who knows? All of this is before my time, so I'm just going off of what I hear on the internet. Although Michael K. Vaughan in his video said it was largely Stan Lee who was the driving force, not actually writing these books, but in commissioning these books. Now, presumably most of the big names were in the first omnibus, Marvel Horror Omnibus. Remember, this is the sequel omnibus, so maybe they were just doing the extras, the extra characters. Yeah, actually, I'll get to that in a moment. Let me just give this a quick overview. You can see just from my flipping through that there's a variety here. There are black and white comics. There are printed stories, which, you're thinking, oh, well, what is this doing in a comic book collection, right? But yeah, get to those in a moment. Now, maybe this is a good example here. I'm not sure how well you guys can see this on camera, but the quality of some of this black and white stuff is not great. The lines are a little bit blurry. Some of this stuff is a bit faded and out of focus. Yeah, can you tell? Otherwise, you can just take my word for it. Sometimes some of these black and white pages are a little bit hard to follow. But that was also integrated with the Marvel color comics. So the editorial decision behind this omnibus obviously was, if it was originally published in black and white, just reprint it in black and white. If it was originally published in color, reprint it in color. I'm not sure what the majority of this book is. I guess it seems to be mostly black and white, doesn't it? But there is a lot of color mixed in with these as well. Oh, something that I should explain. I should have started the review with this. None of these are actually scary at all. And most of them are not attempting to be scary. So, for example, this Wendigo creature is just kind of it's not really horror. It's just like the monster of the week that the X-Men have to fight here. There are some issues where they are going for more of a horror gothic vibe. It's not really scary per se, although I don't know. Maybe it would have been scary to 7-year-old me. Now that I'm a little bit older and jaded, it takes a lot to shock me. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's the introductory stuff out of the way. Shall we go through these? Blade. Okay, everyone knows Blade, right? Those Wesley Snipes movies. Blade started out as a supporting character in Tomb of Dracula. Now, because of the way this omnibus is set up, it just goes through the Blade stories. So we get dropped off right into the middle of the Tomb of Dracula storyline, which I've not read. Michael K. Vaughan and Steve Donahue say Tomb of Dracula is the high point of the Marvel horror collection. We see different storylines going on here. There's Dracula, and then Dracula is being... There's a ongoing battle going on between Dracula and Quincy Harker. Now, according to Wikipedia, Quincy Harker, those names sound familiar. He's the grandson of Jonathan and Mina Harker. And I'm assuming Quincy is named after the Texan Quincy from the Dracula novel. So some continuity with the original Bram Stoker novel. And it looks interesting. But then we are pulled out of Tomb of Dracula and we go into Morbius the Living Vampire, where we are dropped into the storyline that Morbius is on, where he's on some strange planet, something about a genetic wars, and some wars between different mutants. And this big intergalactic story, which all seems interesting, but we're just kind of dropped right in the middle of it because the point is Morbius shows down with Blade. Then after that, we get into, I guess, some more Blade-specific stories here. Again, the quality here of this reprint doesn't seem to be great. I don't know. Maybe the original wasn't all that great. I also wonder if some of these were resized. I think Michael K. Vaughan and Steve Donahue would know better than me, but I think some of these were originally published as big size comics, like, you know, the size of Life magazine. Maybe they were shrunken down here a little bit. Although it's funny. I'm looking at them now in real life, and I'm also looking at them through my view screen. And it seems to be clearer on the view screen. Maybe the camera is not picking up all the confusing shading. Anyways, I won't harp on it. We go through the Blade comics, which are all right. Then we go to Wendigo comics. Wendigo is a bad guy in the Incredible Hulk. And the Wendigo storyline also is the first appearance of Wolverine. Now, I knew this. I had picked it up on Wikipedia sometime over the years. I waste a lot of time on Wikipedia looking up random stuff. So I knew that the Wolverine had his first appearance in the Incredible Hulk. I didn't know it was connected to the Wendigo storyline, but here we go. This is the first appearance of Wolverine here, fighting the Incredible Hulk. Then we go to another Wendigo storyline in black and white, and then Wendigo shows up in the X-Men comics. Because, of course, that connection with Wolverine, now it's the early 80s, and Wolverine is established as a character in the X-Men. Again, we're getting dropped right into the X-Men continuity here. And there's all these X-Men storyline threads that we just have to catch up on. It's a little bit confusing. At the same time, it's very reminiscent of what it used to be like to buy comics on the newsstands. You guys remember those days, right? You pick up a comic book. It has allusions to all these storylines that you're not familiar with because you haven't bought the last 12 issues. But to a certain extent, there's something fascinating about getting glimpses of a larger story. At least that's how I always felt as a kid. This is the X-Men in the 1980s, right? So this was like their heyday, right? The golden age of the X-Men. I've actually never read an X-Men collection before, but these stories seem pretty well written. Characters seem interesting. Be interested to pick up an X-Men collection at some point in the future. We're back to the Hulk storyline here, where Rocky Raccoon from the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, Rocket Raccoon, they're retrieving Gideon's Bible. So I looked this up on Wikipedia. Sure enough, Rocket Raccoon, Gideon's Bible. Before they were a big part of the MCU, it was a riff off of the Beatles song. So now I had Rocky Raccoon stuck in my head for the rest of the day. Anyways, moving on to the next one. Next one is Satana, Satan's daughter, who is a succubus, which I believe is a word I didn't know before I read this, but succubus shows up all the time here. Succubus is, I guess, apparently a woman who can suck the soul out of people. She starts out as a bad guy, but gradually becomes more sympathetic as the series progresses. She doesn't so much evolve naturally as seem to go through different incarnations depending on who's writing the story, which I think is true of a lot of comic book characters, right? You don't notice it so much when it's over the years and when you're buying the issues on the newsstand, but when you read them all together, you're like, okay, well, this character is much more sympathetic in this issue than they were in the last issue, and there doesn't seem to be anything to explain those changes. We also get a lot of written parts in this section. One written part here is actually explained a little bit later. So there's a written storyline here, and then I think they explain it later. It's explained later somewhere. Apparently what happened is there's a miscommunication with the artist. They didn't get the artwork done in time, so they just took the script and published it up in written form. There is a fair amount of gushing by the editorial staff about how awesome this character is. Large part of that is probably marketing, right? They have to talk up their character because they want to talk up sales. I don't know how much of this is genuine, that they genuinely thought this was the best character ever. To me it seems like fairly uninteresting character, but they are really talking up how wonderful she is. Oh, and then there's a second written story about Satana. Now, the first written story about Satana was because there was a miscommunication with the artist. The second written story, I don't know why this is written instead of as a comic book. I went through and I read the whole thing just because when I make a project of reading these things, I read them cover to cover before reviewing them. And it was fairly painless to read, but there was a kind of thing about like, why are you making me read? This is supposed to be my comic book time when I'm reading this book. There is Satana, his brother, is the son of Satan, and they have a little team up / conflict. So yeah, Satana goes from being kind of like a servant of Satan, but she goes from being she gets more sympathetic as this series goes on. There's also an interesting thing going on where there are different powers fighting for the control of hell. And there's what I thought was an interesting little play on Christian mythology. Although when I say Christian here, I guess I'm largely referring to stuff like Paradise Lost, the expanded Christian mythology maybe, where Lucifer was initially God's the leader of the armies of the angels. And then if you're familiar with the story, of course, he launched a rebellion against God and then got cast into hell. But that does, I guess, beg the question, what was he doing when he was the leader of God's armies? Like, before there was a devil, what were those armies doing? So they've taken the idea here that Lucifer, before his fall, was leading the armies of God against the old gods, and so now they want their revenge against Satan, or they want their control over hell. It's to me it seemed, I don't know. I was reading this and it seemed to me like it almost seemed kind of authentic. Like that seems plausible. Were there stories about Lucifer fighting other gods before his fall? So much that I even looked it up on Wikipedia and tried to see if there were any of those stories. But apparently they're not. It's just all an invention of Marvel Comics. But an interesting one. Yeah, and then Satana's final story here is with Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. At this point, she has made unexplained transformation into one of the good guys here, unequivocally. Then we move into, a couple brief stories about Hodiah Twist, who apparently only showed up in a couple of comics. He's has an interesting little gimmick. He's somebody who's cosplaying as Sherlock Holmes, and he because this is Marvel horror, he encounters vampires and werewolves, and he's kind of bumbling his way through it, but through kind of luck or coincidence, manages to survive. And then there's a brief addendum here where it says he shows up referenced in other Marvel continuity, but apparently he only had those two stories. This is another one I looked up on Wikipedia. I looked everything up on Wikipedia. It's one of my weaknesses. As I'm reading, I look everything up on Wikipedia. Actually, if memory serves, you didn't actually have a Wikipedia entry. I had to go to like one of the Marvel fandom Wikipedias. It does look like he was only in these two stories by himself and then appeared in some other stories. Kind of a little forgotten part of the Marvel horror universe. And then we're back with Dracula, with Dracula's daughter. So earlier we had Satana, Satan's daughter. Now we have Dracula's daughter, and it's some of the same notes. Beautiful femme fatale. She's beautiful, but she's also deadly. She starts out as a bad guy, but gradually gets more sympathetic until by the end she's a unequivocal good guy. And again, these changes seem to just kind of happen between issues. They're not so much shown as different writers have different interpretations. She starts out on good terms with Dracula, but then it changes so that she's wants to fight Dracula. And then she has her final appearance in one of the X-Men issues when the X-Men are fighting Dracula. And then this one's a little bit bizarre. War is Hell, which was, I guess, published in the 1970s. And for the first 9 issues, how many issues was it? Yeah, for the first however many issues, I don't know what they were doing with it. But then around issue 9 or 10, they introduced this character of John Kowalski, who was in the invasion of Poland and is somehow punished by death to become one of the reincarnations of death for reasons that are really not fully explained. But as part of his reincarnation, as part of his punishment, he reincarnates the bodies of people who died during the war, and they all have some like sort of final mission that fate has. They have to carry out because of fate. Kind kind of like a quantum leap, if that makes sense. So, for example, he reincarnates the body of this guy who just died in the war, just long enough to guide him to get his family out of the war. It's a bit silly, although what's interesting about this for the history nerds is it does seem to go chronologically through some of the major events of the early events of World War II. So first, the invasion of Poland is the first couple stories. Then we move into the invasion of Finland, which is an interesting little event in the war, because this is... people forget about this, I guess, but the Soviet Union started out on the same side as Germany and invaded Finland as one of the opening salvos in the war before Hitler betrayed the Soviet Union. And then, but I guess, because of this, Finland stayed fighting the Soviet Union all the way through the war. So Finland was one of the Axis powers because the Soviet Union had invaded them. Even though the Soviet Union had invaded them at least initially at the time they were allied with Germany. All this switching side gets a little bit confusing. Then over to Shanghai. Then Dunkirk. Where was this one again? This one was Norway, I think. And then the deserts. So yeah, there's some interesting historical details mixed in here. For example, I did not know that the Polish cavalry fought against the German tanks during the invasion of Poland. And sure enough, I looked this up on Wikipedia, and this is an urban legend. It's an enduring urban legend, something that was apparently published in the newspapers at the time, but was largely untrue. But still, I didn't even know about this urban legend. And I guess you forget when you hear summaries of World War II, you kind of think, okay, the invasion of Poland, the invasion of France, blah, 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 blah. But you forget, like, these events took like a couple months before Poland surrendered. So there was like a war going on in Poland for like a couple months. It wasn't just something that happened overnight. Same with Finland, same with Norway, same with France. One of them is about Dunkirk, right? So, all of which to say is the stories were not always that great, but it made me interested to go on Wikipedia and look some of this stuff up. Then I guess the issues got canceled, so the same character shows up now in modern day continuity. Modern day meaning modern day at the time these issues were published, in the issues of Man-Thing. I don't know anything about Man-Thing, but it's a couple issues of Man-Thing here. Man-Thing seems very similar to Swamp Thing to me, who's also a character I don't know anything about, really. I don't know which was ripping off which. I think Swamp Thing was DC. And then Scarlet Witch shows up with the John Kowalski storyline. And then we go to Ulysses Bloodstone, who's got... the simple version is he's a man who fights monsters. But there's a complicated backstory here about something about a cosmic gem and some aliens and how the gem gets embedded in him and how he's fighting aliens through the centuries. It all strikes me as an idea which has the potential to be interesting. but I'm not sure the writers were really able to develop it much beyond a man who's fighting monsters and has some interesting backstory somewhere in the background of his character. Crossover with Iron Man here. And then this goes on for several issues until there's a conclusion of sorts where it turns out that the Jim was different than he thought all along. A twist ending there, which I'm not sure how much of that had been planned in advance by the writers. Then there's a giant ant story, which we get two versions of it. One is the one that appeared in where was it? 1960. It's in here somewhere. Okay, I can't find the date here, but 1960, this one appeared, and then was the story was retold in the 90s with Ulysses S. Bloodstone recast as the character. So it's a retcon to make this a Ulysses S. Bloodstone. And then the last one, Manphibian. Now, I'm not sure what they're doing here, the editors of this book. Because with all these other stories, we get either the full run, so for example, all the Lilith stories, all the John Kowalski stories, or I'm not sure this is all the Blade stories, but it's a fair sampling. But with Manphibian, we just get one story. And I think, at least according to Wikipedia, this character appeared in some other stories, but for whatever reason, the editors just finish off with one Manphibian story. And that's the whole book. So it's difficult to really give this a review in terms of recommend or don't recommend, because it's a whole bunch of different stories written by a whole bunch of different people, some of which are a little bit plodding, and some of which are quite good. It's, like I said at the beginning of this review, none of it is scary per se, but it's, if you're looking for some mindless entertainment, it's all right. Yeah, it's all right. I don't know. Take my opinion with a grain of salt, maybe, because I have not been reading comic books for years. I've only recently come back to it, partly because only recently got access to these, and partly because I'd gone through a phase where I was more interested in serious books and wasn't going to go back to comic books, but BookTube has inspired me to go back to comic books a little bit. I say all that to say that when I read these, I'm somewhat go into junk food mode, if that makes sense. I know that they're not great. I largely just enjoy how cheesy they are and largely just enjoy the fun of them. And with that attitude, I largely enjoyed these. I'm sure if you wanted to, they're not great literature, and for that matter, I'm not even sure they're great comics if you were to compare them with other comics. But they're good, cheesy fun. Would I recommend you pay full price for it? I don't know. Maybe not. But on the other hand, in terms of hours of reading, you do get hours of reading out of this collection. So you do certainly get your money's worth in terms of the hours it will take you to get through this whole thing. Yeah, it's entertaining. We'll leave it at that.